After leaving his old home, he was abandoned by his daughter on a deserted road and discovered secrets that would change everything. Sometimes the biggest change isn't in what we leave behind, but in what we find along the way. When John decides to sell the house that holds all his memories, he believes he's just starting a new phase. But what should have been a simple transition soon turns into a plot full of mysteries. John never thought he would one day have to sell the house where he had lived almost his entire life. The house was more than just walls and windows. It was the place where he and his late wife, Mary, raised their daughter, Emily, and where they built a life together. Every corner of the house was filled with memories. Emily's room, where she took her first steps, the porch where he and Mary spent summer nights talking for hours, and the kitchen, which always smelled of fresh coffee every morning. John was now 75 years old, and things were no longer the same. Mary had passed away many years ago, and his health was deteriorating. He felt the effects of age, and his daughter, Emily, worried about her father, suggested that he sell the house and move to a smaller, more practical place. "Dad, I know this is hard for you, but you need to think about what's best for your health. You'll be closer to me, and I can take care of you. The new house is easier to maintain with no stairs, and you can live more comfortably." John looked at Emily, the same expression Mary used to have when she spoke seriously. He sighed, the pain in his chest emotional, not physical. "Emily, I know you want what's best for me, but how can I leave this house? Everything I lived with your mother is here. Every wall, every piece of furniture. I feel that if I leave, I'll be leaving behind everything we built together." Emily took her father's hand and squeezed it gently. Her eyes showed understanding and sadness. "Dad, I understand how you feel. It's hard for me too. But I don't want you to suffer anymore. I can't lose you too, like we lost Mom." John's resistance was clear, but Emily's words made him think. He knew she was right. Lately, the stairs were a challenge, and small household accidents were becoming more frequent. Deep down, he knew he couldn't live in that house forever. "I'll think about it, Emily," he said in a softer tone, though his heart was heavy. Weeks later, after another fall that almost resulted in a serious accident, John finally made the difficult decision to sell the house. Emily handled all the details efficiently. She was determined to ensure the process was as quick and painless as possible for her father. On moving day, John walked through the empty house. The furniture had been packed and boxes were stacked in the hallway. He ran his hands over the walls, feeling the cold texture of the wood. The house, now silent, seemed to be bidding him farewell as well. "Goodbye, Mary," John whispered, closing his eyes for a moment, remembering the happy days they lived there. As he was about to leave, Emily appeared beside him, watching her father with a gentle look. She knew this was one of the hardest moments of John's life, and even though she was trying to be strong, she also felt the weight of the farewell. "Are you ready, Dad?" she asked in a calm voice. John took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, dear. I think it's time." Emily hugged him tightly before they helped load the last boxes into the car. They left, and as the car pulled away, John looked out the window one last time. The house faded into the distance, along with all the precious memories. During the drive, Emily tried to cheer him up, describing the new house and how excited she was to show him their new home. John smiled, though his heart still felt heavy. "It'll be a new beginning for both of us, Dad," Emily said, with a hopeful glint in her eyes. John didn't respond immediately. He knew that, although the change was necessary, something inside him still wasn't entirely at peace. Deep down, he knew the real challenge was yet to come. The road seemed endless as John watched the landscape pass by through the car window. The orange sky of the sunset offered a peaceful view, but something was bothering him. Emily was quiet, more so than usual. Her fingers tapped on the steering wheel repeatedly, and she avoided eye contact. John frowned, noticing his daughter's unease. "Emily, is everything all right?" he asked, breaking the silence that had accompanied them for the past hour. Emily glanced quickly at him, forcing a smile. "Yes, Dad, everything's fine. I just need to take care of something quickly." Without further explanation, she slowed the car and pulled over onto the shoulder of a deserted road. John looked around, confused. There was nothing there but arid fields and the empty road. "Why are we stopping here?" John asked, his voice tinged with worry. Emily took a deep breath, clearly hesitant. "Dad, I need to take care of something over there. It won't take long. It's better if you get out of the car and wait for me here. I'll be back in a few minutes, I promise." John watched her closely, sensing something different in his daughter's tone. Despite being confused, he trusted her. With his cane in hand, he got out of the car and settled by the side of the road. Emily started the engine again and drove off, disappearing around the bend. Time passed, and the sun finally set on the horizon. The temperature began to drop, and John, still sitting by the roadside, checked his watch several times. Minutes turned into hours, and worry began to creep into his mind. "Where's Emily?" he murmured, feeling his anxiety grow. The darkness of the night surrounded him, and the sound of the wind rustling the distant trees was his only companion. No cars passed, no lights around. The road seemed deserted, and the silence made the loneliness even more frightening. He tried to stay calm, but something inside him told him that something was wrong. "Emily, where are you?" he whispered, beginning to imagine the worst scenarios. After waiting for some more time, John made a decision. He couldn't stay there. Even with the difficulty of walking, he decided to follow the path where Emily had gone. Each step was a painful effort, and the cane felt too heavy in his hand, but he needed to find his daughter. The silence of the night was oppressive, and every shadow around seemed to move. John tried to push away the dark thoughts, but the fear was unavoidable. "Mary, wherever you are, take care of our daughter," he prayed softly as he continued walking along the deserted road. With each step, the pain in his legs increased, but he didn't give up. John knew something was out of place, and he needed to understand what had happened. Time passed, and the darkness seemed to envelop him completely. However, he kept walking, determined not to stop until he found some answers. "Emily, I'm coming," he muttered to himself, a mix of pain and hope. The road stretched on for miles, and John felt his strength fading. His legs were tired and aching, but he couldn't give up. Then, in the distance, a faint light appeared on the horizon. A house, he thought, quickening his pace as much as his legs would allow. As he got closer, the house seemed isolated, with a low fence and windows weathered by time. The dim light shining through the curtains gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was someone who could help him find Emily. John knocked on the door gently, the sound echoing in the silence of the night. After a few seconds, the door opened slowly, revealing a familiar figure. It was Margaret, his ex-wife, who had disappeared many years ago. John froze, unable to process what he was seeing. "Margaret?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Margaret seemed equally shocked. She looked at him for a few moments before finally speaking, her voice trembling. "John? You're here?" The silence between them was heavy, loaded with years of unanswered questions. John could hardly believe what he was seeing. "What are you doing here?" he asked, still trying to make sense of it. Margaret took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "John, I know this must be a shock to you. It is to me too. I didn't expect to see you here, not like this." John stared at her, the pain and confusion flooding his thoughts. "Why did you leave, Margaret? Why did you never come back?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. Margaret lowered her head, her hands trembling as she clutched the doorframe. I didn't know how to deal with everything. The pressure, the responsibility. I felt like I was failing you and Emily. So, I ran away." John could barely believe what he was hearing. "Ran away? You just left? Without a word? Without a sign?" His voice now held disbelief and pain. "I was lost, Margaret." Emily was devastated. "What were you thinking?" Margaret wiped away a tear that rolled down her face. "I know, John. I know I made a mistake, but at the time I couldn't see another way out. I thought I was doing what was best for you by staying away." John took a deep breath, trying to process the emotions overwhelming him. "And now? What are you doing here, alone in this place?" Margaret looked around, as if searching for an answer in the empty house. "I don't know, John. I've spent years trying to find peace, but I never found it. Maybe it's time to face everything I left behind. The night seemed longer than ever, and John sensed that many answers were still to come. Sitting in the simple armchair in Margaret's house, John felt the warmth of the fireplace soothing his aching joints. However, the pain inside him was much greater than any physical discomfort. He was facing the woman he had loved for so many years, the same woman who had disappeared without a trace. Now, she was there, as real as the memories he had tried to suppress for so long. Margaret sat across from him, holding a cup of tea in her hands, her eyes uncertain. As much as she tried to hide it, she knew that this moment of confrontation was inevitable. John finally broke the silence that hung between them. "Why did you leave, Margaret? I need to understand. You left me without any explanation. I spent years trying to understand what happened, but I never could." Margaret sighed deeply, her eyes fixed on the floor. "John, I know you have every right to be angry with me. I hurt you and I hurt our daughter. But at the time, I couldn't handle the life we were living. Everything felt too heavy for me." John shook his head, incredulous. "Heavy? Margaret, I loved you. I thought we were happy. Why didn't you ever tell me what you were feeling? Why didn't you try to talk to me before just leaving?" Margaret wiped away a tear that refused to stay hidden. "I tried, John. I tried in silence, but you didn't notice. I was so lost in my own thoughts, in my insecurities. I felt like I was failing as a wife, as a mother. And one day it all became unbearable, so I ran away." John looked at her, absorbing every word as if it were a knife to the heart. "You ran away. From us. From me." His voice trembled with the pain he still felt. "And you never came back. Not a letter, not a phone call. You left me not knowing if you were alive or dead, Margaret." Margaret began to cry silently, her body trembling with regret. "I know, John. I know I made a mistake. Every day since I left, I thought about coming back. But the shame was stronger than the courage. I felt like a burden to you and to Emily. I thought you would be better off without me." John stared at her, anger and pain battling within him. "Better without you? Margaret, I spent years trying to understand why you left. And Emily, she suffered so much. Do you know how much she needed you? Do you know what she went through?" Margaret raised her head, her eyes filled with regret. "I know, John. I failed you both. And even now, I don't know how to fix this. But I'm willing to try, if you'll let me." John was silent for a long time, looking at the fireplace, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. Finally, he took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive everything all at once, Margaret. But maybe we can start. For Emily." Margaret smiled sadly, wiping away her tears. "For Emily." The night continued, the two talking about the past, the hurts, and the mistakes. For the first time in many years, John felt that, despite everything, there might be a chance for redemption. The days following the reunion with Margaret passed slowly. Although they had begun to confront the feelings of the past, something still haunted John. Emily, his daughter, had disappeared on that road, and her absence was an open wound in his heart. Each day that passed without news deepened his anguish. Margaret, noticing John's growing despair, suggested they go to the nearest town in search of information. "We need to find out what happened to Emily. We can't go on like this without answers," said Margaret, determined. John agreed, but deep down, a part of him was terrified of what they might find. The trip to town was silent. John looked out the window, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He couldn't shake the fear that something terrible had happened to his daughter. "She wouldn't leave me on purpose," he murmured to himself, trying to push away the negative thoughts. Margaret, at the wheel, kept John's hand firmly in hers, offering silent comfort. She knew words wouldn't be enough to soothe him at that moment. Upon arriving in town, they started asking around at markets, cafes, and gas stations if anyone had seen Emily or her car. The answers were always negative, which increased John's frustration. She was so excited about the move. "I don't understand what could have gone wrong," he muttered as they walked through the town streets, his gaze distant. Margaret was about to agree when John suddenly stopped and started rummaging through his coat pockets. "I have the address of the new house," he exclaimed, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Margaret looked at him in surprise. Let's go there. Maybe she went back to the new house. With the address in hand, they got in the car and drove along the road. The trip was tense, the silence between them reflecting the anxiety in the air. John looked out the window, searching for any sign that might lead to Emily. When they finally reached the destination, they found a modern, large, and well-kept house. Outside, they saw Emily talking with a man John didn't know. His heart raced, and he stopped walking for a moment, watching from a distance. "Who is that man?" he asked Margaret, feeling a twinge of suspicion. John and Margaret got out of the car and walked to the door. Emily, seeing them, froze in surprise, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected this reunion, much less seeing her parents together. "Dad? Mom? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. John took a step forward, his voice filled with confusion and pain. "Emily, what happened? Why did you leave me on that road? I waited for hours and you never came back." Emily looked away, clearly nervous. "Dad, I came back, but you weren't there anymore. I searched, but I thought you had moved on," she said, her voice wavering. John looked at her, incredulous. "Moved on? I was alone, in the middle of nowhere. Emily, what's going on?" Margaret put a hand on John's shoulder, trying to calm him. "Let's hear what Emily has to say. We're here now. Let's work this out together." Emily looked at them both, her expression torn between surprise and guilt. She knew she had many things to explain, but wasn't sure if she was ready. John and Margaret stood waiting for an explanation as they watched Emily struggle to find the right words. The presence of the unknown man beside her only heightened the tension in the air. John could feel his heart racing, his jaw trembling with anger and disappointment. Emily, on the other hand, looked lost, as if she didn't know where to begin. "Dad, Mom, I don't know what to say." Her voice was hesitant, and the nervousness was evident in every word. John couldn't hold back any longer. "What's going on, Emily? Why did you leave me on that road? I waited for hours for you. I was alone." His voice was a mixture of pain and indignation. Emily avoided his gaze, clearly feeling the weight of her guilt. "Dad, I came back, but you were no longer there. I was desperate. I thought maybe you had found a way back or that someone had helped you. I made a mistake. I know I made a mistake." Margaret, who had been silent until then, stepped forward. "Emily, who is this man?" she asked, looking at the stranger beside her daughter. Emily glanced at the man, who remained silent throughout the interaction. He's a real estate agent. We met during the house sale process and we got closer. I was so anxious about everything, and when I couldn't find you on the road, he convinced me to move on. I don't know what I was thinking, Dad. I was confused." John shook his head, trying to process what he was hearing. "Move on? Without me? Emily, you left me in the middle of nowhere. I don't understand." His voice cracked, betrayed by the disappointment. Emily began to cry. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to abandon you. I thought you were okay, that you'd gotten help. I let fear and confusion take over." Margaret stepped closer, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, we've all made mistakes, but we're here now, as a family. We need to understand what happened, but we also need to find a way to move forward together." John looked at Margaret, still grappling with everything that had happened. The reunion with the woman who left him years ago, Emily's hesitant explanation. It was too much to handle. Emily wiped her tears, her body trembling with emotion. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was so scared I wouldn't be able to handle everything. The house, the move. I feel like I failed you." John stepped closer to Emily and hugged her, feeling his heart heavy but filled with understanding. "Emily, I love you, and I forgive you. We'll get through this together." Margaret smiled softly, sensing that, despite everything, there was hope for the future. The three of them embraced, united by the desire to rebuild the trust and bonds that had been broken over the years. As the evening light enveloped the house, John knew that, though the road ahead was uncertain, they were ready to face it together.